In the summer of 1942, high above the deep blue waters of the Pacific, Japanese naval aviators carried themselves with a confidence forged by months of unbroken success. The Zero fighter, lightweight and astonishingly agile, had dominated every sky it entered. American pilots, many inexperienced and flying older aircraft, struggled to counter its turning ability, its climb rate, and the skill of the men who flew it. Japanese pilots believed they understood their enemy. They believed the Americans would continue fighting the same predictable way: tight formations, conservative maneuvers, and rigid attack patterns. Tactics that the Zero's maneuverability could dismantle with ease. But one morning, during an operation that began like countless others, something changed. As a Japanese formation approached what appeared to be another routine interception, the American fighters behaved differently. They did not turn to dogfight. They did not climb to engage. They did not fall back into defensive circles. Instead, they attacked using new angles, new speeds, and new timing, tactics designed with a single purpose: to break the Zero's advantage of maneuverability and force combat into vertical, energy-driven engagements where American aircraft could finally fight on their own terms. The Japanese pilots expected an easy victory. What they encountered instead was shock, confusion, and the first signs that the air war over the Pacific was changing forever. This is the reconstructed account of the moment Japanese aviators first realized that America was no longer flying the same way, and that the sky they once controlled was becoming a far more dangerous place. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation operated with a confidence unmatched in the Pacific. Their doctrine was refined, their pilots rigorously trained, and their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, had proven superior to nearly everything the Allies could send into the sky. For Japanese aviators, early 1942 felt like confirmation that the training methods of the Imperial Navy were not only justified, but destined to dominate the war's aerial battles. The Zero's reputation grew rapidly. Its extraordinary maneuverability allowed it to outturn nearly all Allied fighters. Its climb rate gave pilots the ability to dictate engagements, and its long range enabled deep strikes and extended patrols far beyond what American aircraft could sustain. To pilots who had trained for years in isolation, mastering formation discipline and precision aerobatics, the Zero was more than a weapon. It was proof of the superiority of Japanese aviation philosophy. By the time the first major air battles of 1942 unfolded across the Pacific, Japanese pilots had gained something equally important: momentum. They had defeated British, Dutch, and American air units in rapid succession. Each victory reinforced the belief that their tactical approach was fundamentally superior. Turning engagements, tightly coordinated formation attacks, and disciplined throttle control had produced results again and again. Pilots learned to anticipate American responses long before they appeared. From the flight decks of carriers to isolated island airfields, this confidence shaped the attitude of entire squadrons. Briefings often emphasized precision and predictability, traits the Imperial Navy considered essential to the warrior ethos. Many pilots believed deeply that their training had created a level of aerial mastery Western forces could not match. Even younger aviators, newly deployed to frontline units, absorbed this sense of certainty from the veterans around them. But this confidence, while earned, came with a subtle consequence: an expectation that the enemy would continue flying exactly as he had in the past. American attack patterns were well known. Their fighters often committed early to turning engagements, allowing Japanese pilots to exploit their aircraft's lightweight design. Defensive formations tended to tighten rather than scatter, making them vulnerable to coordinated slashing attacks. Even when American pilots tried to disengage, The Zero's range and agility allowed Japanese aviators to maintain control of the fight. Time and again, Japanese squadrons returned from missions reporting similar outcomes. American pilots had fought bravely, but predictably. Their tactics did not change. Their mistakes repeated themselves. This pattern reinforced a belief that the Imperial Navy's dominance would continue indefinitely. But beneath the surface of these early triumphs, changes were already taking shape on the American side. Changes Japanese intelligence did not yet detect. Instructors were rewriting training manuals. Pilots were experimenting with new climb patterns, energy retention maneuvers, and loose formation tactics designed to counter the Zero's advantages. Engineers were studying combat reports to adjust fuel mixtures, propeller settings, and throttle responses. These developments were small at first, incremental, hardly noticeable to an opponent accustomed to victory. But they were happening. And by mid-1942, enough American pilots had survived initial encounters with the Zero to understand something crucial. They could not win by fighting the Japanese the same way. New tactics were beginning to appear, subtle at first, then increasingly deliberate. Tactics that did not rely on turning with a Zero, but on denying it the turning fight altogether. Japanese pilots, confident in their mastery of traditional dogfighting, had not yet encountered these changes. Their world was still shaped by the early months of decisive success. And so, on the morning when they finally met American fighters who no longer behaved the way they expected, the reaction across the formation was the same. Confusion first, then surprise, then a realization that the sky was beginning to shift. For the Japanese squadron stationed on a remote Pacific Island airstrip, the morning began like countless others. The weather was stable, the winds calm, and the early light cast long shadows across the metal skins of the Zeros parked in neat rows along the coral runway. Pilots moved with steady discipline, checking their maps, reviewing their altitude tables, and listening to the familiar rhythm of pre-flight instructions. Nothing suggested that the day would be any different from the dozens of sorties flown in the preceding months. Their mission was straightforward: intercept an approaching American formation detected at long range. Intelligence officers believed it to be a reconnaissance flight, possibly escorted by a small group of fighters. This type of encounter had become routine. Japanese pilots typically climbed to altitude, positioned themselves above the enemy, and then executed a coordinated diving attack, an approach that had repeatedly overwhelmed American flyers early in the war. The formation lifted off the runway with practiced precision. Engines roared in synchronized bursts as the Zeros rose steadily from the island, banking northward toward open water. The pilots settled into familiar roles, maintaining spacing and altitude with the quiet confidence of men who had done this many times before. Each aviator understood his place in the attack pattern, and each trusted that the enemy's response would follow predictable lines. As they ascended into cleaner air, thin bands of cloud drifted beneath them, creating a layered panorama of white and blue stretching out toward the horizon. Visibility was excellent, another sign in their minds that the mission would unfold smoothly. They expected to spot the Americans first, position themselves advantageously, and strike with the same coordinated discipline that had brought them so many victories. But as the Japanese formation approached the estimated interception point, something felt different. The rangefinder aboard the lead aircraft identified movement earlier than anticipated. The American planes were already climbing, rapidly, and not in the tight defensive groups the Japanese had come to expect. Instead of forming a slow, compact cluster, the American fighters were spreading out horizontally, leaving wide gaps between aircraft. This was unusual. Traditionally, American flyers had relied on close formations for mutual support. Tight groups made them easier targets for slashing Japanese attacks. but they offered comfort and protection for inexperienced crews. Yet now, what the Japanese saw below them looked less like a defensive block and more like a loose network of climbing aircraft spaced deliberately to cover a wider section of the sky. The Japanese pilots maintained formation, descending gradually into their standard attack pattern. But as they prepared to initiate their dive, the Americans did something unexpected. They did not turn toward the Japanese. They did not break into defensive circles. They did not commit to a turning engagement. Instead, the American fighters continued climbing, not toward the Japanese formation, but past it, using their momentum to gain altitude and energy rather than positioning for an immediate fight. Their approach resembled an inverted L shape, a maneuver unfamiliar to most Japanese pilots. This shift did not immediately trigger alarm, but confusion spread quietly through the formation. The Americans were not reacting as they should. They were not falling into the predictable trap. They were increasing altitude and waiting. The lead Japanese pilots tried to reposition, but the timing fell off. The Americans were no longer flying patterns optimized for the Zero strengths. Their speed and climb angles kept them out of the traditional attack window. And instead of turning into the Japanese dive, they accelerated into shallow vertical climbs, forcing the Zeros into energy-draining maneuvers if they attempted to follow. The Japanese formation completed its initial pass without the usual sense of control or advantage. What should have been a routine interception was becoming something else, an encounter shaped by movements the Japanese had not seen before. For the first time in months, they sensed that the Americans were not reacting to them. They were executing something new, a tactic designed not to counter the Zero, but to avoid playing its game entirely. The Japanese formation tightened naturally as they prepared to make a second pass. Their initial attack had produced no decisive result, not because the Americans had outflown them, but because they had refused to engage in the expected way. This alone introduced an unease that many of the pilots had not felt before. Combat success in the early Pacific months had conditioned them to anticipate predictable reactions. But now, the enemy seemed to be making entirely different choices. As the Zeros pulled up from their diving attack, the Americans responded with a maneuver the Japanese had rarely seen. They turned their noses downward, not toward the threat, but away from it, entering controlled, energy-conserving dives that increased airspeed far beyond what the Japanese expected at that stage of the engagement. This allowed the American fighters to convert altitude into momentum, forcing any Zero that attempted to pursue them into a high-speed chase that compromised its strengths. Japanese pilots quickly recognized the pattern. The Americans were refusing the horizontal fight. They were avoiding the turn. They were staying fast, deliberately, persistently, and effectively. The Zero, while unmatched in low-speed maneuverability, suffered in steep dives at high velocity. Its lightweight frame, which granted superior agility, also made it vulnerable to structural stress during prolonged high-speed descents. American aircraft, particularly the newer models being introduced, were more robust in these conditions, capable of retaining stability and gaining speed even under punishing gravitational forces. As the Japanese pilots repositioned for a third attempt, the Americans executed another new maneuver, a climbing turn into the vertical plane. This motion, almost like the rising edge of a spiraling arc, was designed to exploit the greater horsepower and sturdier airframes of American fighters. In essence, they were pulling the fight upward, into a zone where the Zero's advantage faded. The Japanese reacted instinctively, attempting to follow. But in climbing pursuit, the Zero's engines struggled to maintain the same rate of ascent as the heavier American aircraft. The gap widened, not dramatically, but steadily enough to disrupt the Japanese attack rhythm. In dogfighting terms, control of the energy state was shifting. This was the moment that changed everything. The American fighters, now above and ahead of the Zeros, dove back down in shallow, coordinated attacks, not turning engagements, but swift, high-speed slashes that forced Japanese pilots into defensive reactions. The Zero's slow roll rate at high speed made it ill-suited to counter these vertical slashing attacks. The Americans had discovered a tactic that bypassed the Zero's strengths entirely: the boom and zoom method. For months, Japanese pilots had viewed American flyers as hesitant, prone to turning into traps, and ill-prepared for the disciplined style of air combat the Imperial Navy had mastered. But in this engagement, it became clear that the Americans had adapted. They had studied the Zero, learned its weaknesses, and adjusted their entire approach to neutralize it. The Japanese pilots found themselves reacting rather than dictating. They were being forced to defend rather than pursue. The clarity and confidence that had once shaped their movements began to dissolve amid unexpected patterns. The change was subtle yet decisive. A shift in altitude here, a delayed turn there, a refusal to commit to the horizontal fight. But these small tactical adjustments compounded over seconds and minutes, and together they reshaped the entire engagement. Some pilots attempted to reassert control by initiating familiar turning maneuvers, hoping to draw the Americans back into the type of fight the Zero excelled in. But the Americans did not follow. Each time a Japanese pilot tried to pivot the battle into a slow-speed turn, the Americans simply climbed away or dove past, maintaining higher energy and speed. The Japanese formations, once synchronized and fluid, began to fragment. Pilots struggled to maintain cohesion while facing an enemy that refused to behave predictably. This was the moment many Japanese aviators later described, not as a defeat, but as a shock. A realization that the dynamics of the air war were shifting and that their long-standing tactical superiority was beginning to erode. As the engagement unfolded across the broad expanse of Pacific sky, the Japanese formation faced a situation more unfamiliar than anything they had experienced since the beginning of the war. What had started as a routine interception was now dissolving into a scattered, energy-driven battle in which the Americans, not the Japanese, determined the tempo. And for the first time, veteran aviators who had built their confidence through months of success found themselves reacting with a growing sense of unease. The Zero had always commanded the horizontal plane. Its unmatched maneuverability allowed it to dominate turning engagements, slipping behind slower enemy fighters and maintaining precise control at lower speeds. But the Americans were no longer giving them that fight. The air battles Japanese pilots had trained for, the ones drilled into them since flight school, were disappearing before their eyes. Each time a Japanese pilot attempted to pull an opponent into a turn, the American aircraft simply refused to follow. Instead, they retained their speed, climbed away, or dove into a steep energy-building maneuver that made pursuit dangerous. The Japanese pilots recognized these movements as intentional. The Americans were not retreating. They were repositioning. Shock spread gradually, but distinctly through the formation. The familiar cues of air combat, enemy hesitation, predictable turns, forced engagements, were absent. The new American tactics exploited the Zero's weaknesses with a precision that few Japanese pilots had expected this early in the war. The fragmentation of the Japanese formation was not chaotic, but it revealed an underlying tension. Pilots who were used to flying in tight, coordinated groups now found themselves isolated in small clusters, separated by altitude differences and small timing errors forced on them by the Americans' vertical maneuvers. Maintaining cohesion required energy, and the Zeros were expending far more than usual. Attempts to reform were met with additional complications. American fighters, attacking from higher altitudes, struck in brief, slashing passes that forced Japanese pilots to break off attempts at regrouping. The Zeros could evade these attacks with their agility, but the process disrupted formation recovery and drained their energy state even further. In the cockpit, Japanese aviators could read the changing patterns in the sky, the angles, the altitude differentials, the transitions between dive and climb. Nothing aligned with the combat rhythm they had mastered. The Americans were not only faster, they were using their speed deliberately, methodically, and with a discipline that felt entirely new. Even experienced pilots sensed the shift. Men who had survived the intense early battles of the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies knew what well-executed tactics looked like. And the movements unfolding around them were unmistakable signs of a force that had adapted quickly and effectively. The Zero's vulnerabilities, long masked by its maneuverability and early war dominance, were being exposed in real time. Its limited dive speed ceiling, its fragile frame under high-stress maneuvers, and its difficulty maintaining energy in steep climbs, all weaknesses that American engineers and tacticians had studied, were now being targeted with precision. The Japanese pilots were not losing control of the battle, but they were losing control of the context of the battle. The Americans were shaping the engagement, dictating its structure, and selecting when to strike. Each new pass carved deeper into the routine the Japanese relied on. Small gaps formed in the formation, and pilots who had once moved with seamless coordination now found themselves adjusting constantly to regain positional advantage. The cohesion that once defined Japanese aerial dominance was eroding, not through panic or disorganization, but through the subtle pressure of an opponent using entirely different rules. For the first time, the Japanese formation was experiencing something they had not known since the beginning of the war. They were no longer certain of what the Americans were going to do next. And in the vast, unforgiving sky over the Pacific, uncertainty was as dangerous as any bullet. As the engagement stretched on, the Japanese pilots began to recognize the broader pattern emerging around them. The Americans were no longer scattered opponents improvising their responses. They were flying with a unified purpose, coordinated through newly adopted tactics that emphasized altitude, speed retention, and vertical maneuvering. Each slashing attack, each climbing break, and each controlled dive was part of a larger tactical shift that Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. The implications became clearer with each passing minute. The Japanese fighters could evade individual attacks, but they could not control the engagement. Their attempts to reset the battle, climbing back into the sun, pulling into textbook formation turns, or circling to regain cohesion, were interrupted repeatedly by the Americans' energy-driven passes. Every Zero that tried to dictate the fight found itself reacting instead to an opponent who understood precisely when to commit and when to disengage. For the Japanese aviators, this shift felt almost intangible at first, like a subtle imbalance in the air, a disruption of the predictable rhythm that once defined every encounter. But the longer the engagement continued, the more undeniable it became. The Americans were fighting with an entirely different mindset, one that leveraged the structural strengths of their aircraft and compensated for the Zero's unmatched maneuverability by avoiding its strongest domain altogether. Within the Japanese formation, pilots began to sense the strain on their aircraft. The Zero's lightweight airframe, so dominant in turn-based dogfights, was less suited for the steep dives and high-speed chases forced upon it. The wings vibrated under stress, and the engines struggled to maintain power during prolonged climbs. What had once been a graceful, fluid machine now felt increasingly out of place in the vertical maneuvers unfolding across the sky. Even the veterans, men who had survived the early offensives with confidence in their own abilities, recognized the changing dynamics. They understood that air combat was not simply a contest of skill but of energy management, aircraft design, and tactical adaptation. And the Americans had adapted. They were using the strengths of their planes, notably their durability, speed in dives, and improved power-to-weight ratios, to fight a battle the Zero could not dominate. At one point in the engagement, a group of Japanese pilots attempted to reset by climbing together into a defensive arc, hoping to force the Americans to engage horizontally. But the Americans did not take the bait. They remained fast, circling just outside the Zero's optimal turning radius, waiting for the moment the Japanese planes bled enough energy to become vulnerable. Their discipline was unmistakable. They were following a refined doctrine, not improvising, not reacting in panic, but executing. The Japanese formation fragmented again, not through fear, but through fatigue and mechanical limits. The once unified squadron began to stretch across the sky, each pilot trying to conserve energy, avoid stalling climbs, and anticipate the next American pass. The smooth cohesion of earlier battles was gone. The Zero pilots were still skilled, still dangerous, still fiercely committed, but they were no longer fighting an enemy trapped in outdated tactics. They were fighting an opponent who had learned. Eventually, as fuel levels dwindled and the Americans maintained positional advantage, the Japanese commander signaled a general withdrawal. It was not a retreat in panic. Rather, a tactical decision acknowledging that the battle could no longer be shaped on Japanese terms. The fighters pulled away in small groups, descending toward the distant outline of their island base. Engines strained from the constant climbs and dives. As they flew home, the shock settled in. Not fear, but realization. This engagement was different. The Americans had not simply fought better. They had fought differently. The Zero could still dominate in the right conditions. Japanese pilots were still among the most skilled in the world. But the sky over the Pacific had shifted. And the pilots who landed on that island runway understood something their commanders had yet to grasp. The Americans had changed the rules of the air war, and they were not going back. When the surviving Zeros descended toward their island runway, the mood in the cockpits was markedly different from the one that had carried them into battle. Nothing in the engagement resembled the victories that had defined the earliest months of the Pacific War. The confidence born from those triumphs had not disappeared, but it had been shaken in a way many of the pilots had never experienced. In the official reports submitted later that day, the engagement was recorded simply: limited contact with American fighters, no decisive results, and a withdrawal due to fuel constraints and positional disadvantage. But the spare, factual language of the report masked the deeper truth witnessed by every Japanese aviator involved. This was the first time they had seen American tactics evolve deliberately, systematically, and effectively. For months, Japanese pilots had assumed that their enemies would continue flying the same way. Tight formations, predictable turns, and defensive instincts that played directly into the Zero's strengths. But in this encounter, the Americans took the opposite approach. They refused the turning fight. They stopped chasing horizontal control, and they began fighting a vertical, energy-driven battle in which their aircraft could survive and prevail. The Japanese pilots understood the significance immediately. It was not a defeat. The engagement had been indecisive, but the implications were unmistakable. If the Americans continued refining these tactics, and if they gained more experienced pilots, newer aircraft, and stronger logistical support, the skies over the Pacific would no longer be shaped solely by Japanese doctrine. What unsettled the aviators most was not a single moment, but the pattern they observed: an opponent learning, adapting, and improving at a pace faster than expected. The Zero was still deadly. Japanese pilots were still highly skilled. But this engagement marked a turning point. The Americans had studied the Zero. They had learned how to deny its advantage. and they were beginning to build an air strategy that would eventually reshape the war. For the pilots who flew back to that island base, the realization was sobering. Their dominance of the early Pacific skies had not vanished, but it was no longer unquestioned. A new phase of the air war had begun, one in which control would depend not only on skill and bravery, but on adaptation, innovation, and the ability to evolve. On that day, high above the Pacific, the Japanese pilots were not defeated, but they were shocked. And from that moment forward, they understood that the sky itself was changing. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.